I'm aware you have acknowledged country previously, but I would like to personally acknowledge country by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and where we all collectively gather today. I'm in Brisbane, which is the Turrbal, Yuggera and Jagera people. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to also recognise their custodianship and role in caring for and maintaining country over thousands of years. And for this session and for the rest of the weekend, may their strength and wisdom be with us today. So I'd like to just give you a brief overview of the session that we're going to have. So we're going to talk about mental health and mental illness, and the reason we're going to talk about mental illness as well as mental health, I'll explain in the next slide or so, but we are going to cover some areas around mental illness. Now, it's not too pointy a presentation. We're not going to talk about a lot of really scary things, but at some point during the session, I'm going to talk about suicide and give you some statistics around that. So I'll let you know prior to that when that comes up. Most people are okay with it, but if you know your own self-care needs and you feel like you need to step away from the screen or mute me for a while, please be comfortable doing that. It's important that you manage your self-care around this. We won't be talking in depth about it, but it will be covered a little bit later on in the session. So we're going to talk about mental illness a little bit. We're going to talk about signs and symptoms so that you can help recognise either in yourself or in your community where people are starting to become mentally unwell. We're going to talk about contributing factors for that, predominantly so that you can help avoid some of the contributing factors or help minimise those, or so that you can identify where your community are more at risk. We're going to talk about access to supports, and Sam's going to really help me here, Sam, with some of the more localised supports that you might need as scholars or individuals. We're going to talk about barriers to support so that we can help you break down some of those barriers, or at least recognise when they're in place, because sometimes we don't realise the barriers are there until somebody points them out to us. And then we're going to talk about support in a crisis. And I think, Sam, and you can jump in later if I'm wrong on this, we'll talk about the mental health plans that scholars can access as part of your Pinnacle support. I know previously they've been really useful for people.
Absolutely. And just in terms of structuring an ethic of care within this session, if there's any scholars or mentors that do need to switch cameras off or, just step out for a little bit, feel free to do exactly what you need. You're the best judge of that. And if you would like to chat to me, please reach out either via the chat function, email, or phone or text. But yeah, I think it will all be hopefully fairly impactful for you all. So back to you, Irene.
Cool, thanks, Sam. And just to add to that, Sam, and that's a really good point, if you are going to take a step away because you're not travelling well, could you message Sam on the chat function independently just to let them know what you're doing, so that one of us can touch base with you afterwards just to make sure you've got some support around it. Now, it is a very light on session, but again, there may be some areas that are challenging for people. I have occasionally cried during this session, so it's okay if you have your own needs, but if you could touch base with Sam and let them know where you're at, and we'll touch base with you later. Thanks for that, Sam. So when we talk about mental health versus mental illness, there's a lot of misconceptions about the terminology mental health, and sometimes when we talk about that, people go, I don't have mental health, and well, basically everybody does have mental health, and I'll give you the World Health Organization's category of what we call mental health, and I've changed the pronouns in this because the World Health Organization made a bit more of a binary statement, but basically mental health in itself is a state of well-being in which every individual realises their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. So nothing's super out there or excelling, it's just about basically having an ordinary life with ordinary feelings and thoughts, and sometimes life can be just a bit crap. Sometimes it can be great, sometimes it's rubbish. And when you're feeling on a spectrum of if bad things are happening to you and you're feeling bad about them, that's still ordinary and normal mental health experiences where you're processing your environment and you're experiencing things normally dependent on the circumstances. Where it becomes an issue is if you're in the spectrum of poor mental health for a longer period of time, it can present more risks to ongoing support needs. And that's what leads us on to the mental illness component. So mental illness is, there's three crucial factors to it, and we're not going to talk about massive diagnostics this afternoon. I'm going to give you a very light touch view of things that you can see where people might be at risk or experiencing periods of being unwell. So we won't go through any kind of diagnostic terms, but I do want to give you a little bit of an overview about when poor mental health becomes more risky and can transition into mental illness. So mental illness is diagnosable, and there's three main components for it. It affects your emotional state and behaviour. So it impacts on your thinking, your emotional state, and your day-to-day behaviour in a negative way. Your capacity to complete day-to-day activities. Now, whatever your daily activities were normally, if you're normally quite sedentary or you have a particular type of lifestyle, the disruption is that it negatively impacts it. So nobody makes judgments if you nap till 12 o'clock every day, if you could, or that you do things in a particular way. It's about the disruption to the life that you normally have. And the third diagnostic criteria is that it's consistent over a period of time. And that links back to the mental health versus mental illness. Like if you have poor mental health for a period of time and it's linked to a particular circumstance, that's okay. It's still not great and you're still experiencing something that's not particularly pleasant, but it doesn't mean it's a diagnosable mental illness. But it's when it's consistent over a period of time, impacts your thinking and disrupts your capacity to function in day-to-day life. That's when it becomes more problematic and where you might want to seek help. And we'll talk about help seeking later. And the reason we bring it up, and again, is that people who experience longer periods of poor mental health are more at risk of developing a mental illness. So ordinarily at this part, because I could see people's faces, I'd ask for questions or thoughts, but I'm just going to plough on, if that's okay, with giving you a bit more information, and at the end we'll have more of a Q&A. If there are things that you're going, gee, I really want to know a bit more about that, can you shove it in the chat and we'll talk about it at the end? Or Sam, if you're okay, I can't see the chat at the moment because of the way that my presentation is. Sam will be able to touch base with you and either we'll hold off the question till later or we'll answer it at the time. So in terms of mental illness, there's many types, but there are three main types of mental illness that's predominant in Australia and actually most of first world countries. So mood disorders, anxiety disorders and substance use disorders are the three main types. And these are the ones that we're going to focus on today because they're probably easier and more relatable in terms of just giving you a generic overview of mental illness. For areas such as psychosis or personality disorders, there's a bit more complexity in how we would go about supporting those or even identifying them, supporting them and helping people through recovery. So just for the purpose of today, we're just going to talk about the three main areas. And to give you just a little bit of statistics, anxiety disorders got the highest prevalence in Australia at the moment, followed by mood disorders and then substance use disorders. And there are some sex-related variances around people experiencing them, but I think in terms of how we need to understand it today, they're not really important to know, just that there can be some biological impacts dependent on certain areas. But the next couple of slides, I'm just going to talk through signs and symptoms of each specific area. And if there are questions, Sam, are you okay to shout out at the end of anxiety, then disorder, and then substance use disorder, if there's any questions to touch on?
Yeah, will do, Irene.
Awesome. Cool. And you're still all okay with my accent?
Yes, loving.
Cool. We're 10 minutes in and I've not sworn yet, so we're kind of winning. Okay, so anxiety. So anxiety disorder, and we're not talking about your ordinary lifestyle anxiety, like things like getting anxious about studying or working towards an exam. That is fair and reasonable. Anxiety is a good emotion to have. It helps protect us from danger and helps us behave in particular ways to help us respond to stimulus. So anxiety in itself is not a bad thing, but it's when we go back to the diagnostic criteria, when it's impacting our life negatively, impacts our thoughts and feelings negatively, and is persistent over a period of time, that's when it can become quite challenging for us. So there are a couple of different aspects of anxiety. So there's physical areas. Now, I'm not going to read all of these out word for word. If you do need me to clarify any language, that's fine, but you'll get the slide pack after this anyway, and there are some links to where I've got this information from at the back of the slide pack. But there are physical aspects of anxiety that can, like, you can genuinely physically feel them, you know, tightening of the chest, hot and cold flushes, etc. And that can be quite distressing in itself, especially if you don't realise it's anxiety. There's a lot of other things that physical aspects could link to. So if you are getting quick breath tightening of the chest, even though it may be anxiety, it's still worth getting checked out by a medical professional to check that there's no underlying or overt medical symptoms, like physical symptoms that you're experiencing. I'm sure if we think about even just those feelings, physical feelings at the moment, we've all experienced those from time to time, but could be incredibly fatiguing if we're experiencing them over a long period. Some of the psychological aspects of anxiety, excessive fear. Now, if you're in the forest and you're being chased by a big bear, that's not excessive fear. That's a real fear that you may be at harm, and that's okay. It's okay to feel anxious about that and have those physical and psychological symptoms. But if it's just your general day-to-day stuff, or there's overexertion of fear based on your circumstances, that's something to maybe start thinking about, not worrying about, but seeking some support for. Catastrophizing, certainly that's something that's happened quite a lot during are we allowed to talk about COVID and pandemic? And it's certainly something over the last couple of years that's been quite prevalent, and that has seen a spiked increase in anxiety. People don't want to become unwell, and then there is catastrophizing around what happens in those circumstances. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong or inappropriate to have anxiety around COVID. It absolutely is, but it's another environmental factor that's helping add to people accessing mental health support. So the third area that people experience with anxiety is behavioural. Now, this isn't for everybody, but sometimes when people experience anxiety, they might avoid the situations that make them feel anxious. And this in particular for the university aspect could impact on study and sorry, not just university, any educational aspect or any situational work or social life. If you're avoiding areas that would ordinarily help you stay connected to community or have protective factors, and then you having positive well-being, that can be quite detrimental to you down the line. But I think we've all been in a position, I'm hoping nobody's stuck their finger in an electric socket before with or done that, but if you did and you got a shock, you'd know not to do it again. That's reasonable avoidance of a situation that will cause you harm. If you know something's going to hurt you, it's reasonable to avoid it. But avoiding situations that make you feel anxious, especially if there are areas where they can be managed in a different way, that can create a lot of impact in that space. So I'm going to pause for a breath there and check in with Sam. Sam, are there any questions or any comments anybody wants to make on the anxiety aspect?
No questions, although maybe they're about to be sent. But the comment that we do have in the chat, Irene, is accent is magical. Thank you. So,
Sure.
yeah, it's landing
For
really.
whoever that was, thank you very much. It has gotten me away with many, many naughty things. Most of them I'm proud of, but thank you for that. I appreciate it. So, any questions popping up? Okay, if there aren't any at the moment and you want to add them at the end, but the reason for giving you this is so that you can help recognise in yourself or in your colleagues or community when somebody might be getting to the point of seeking support. And we'll talk about the seeking support thing probably in about 10 to 15 minutes or so. I promise not to talk at you the whole time, but we're quite limited in the format that we've got and the timescales that we've got. So I'm going to move on now to mood disorders, and mood disorders can commonly be described as things like depression. So that's what we're talking about. I'm not going to go into multiple layers of mood disorders, but effectively what we're talking about at the moment is depression and associated mood disorders. I'm not going to go into detail around areas like bipolar disorder in this because we're limited into what I can give you at that particular point. But as I've said at any scholar induction, if scholars or mentors feel like they need more information on particular areas, I'm always happy to provide more of that outside of the format of this meeting. So we'll go through mood disorders. So again, there's behavioural aspects that you might recognise in people. And again, go back to this is when it's something that changes in your behaviour or impacts your behaviour negatively. If you generally don't go out and you still don't go out, probably not a massive thing to worry about. But if you're used to doing particular things and that's changing to your detriment, and that's a concern for us. So some of the behaviours that you might see in other people or experience in yourself is not having the capacity to get things completed at either work, school, social, uni, withdrawn from social circumstances or people that can actually help provide some connection for you. Relying on the use of alcohol or other drugs and sedatives, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well around the LGBTIQ community and use of substances, and where there's some additional factors there. Not being able to get enjoyment out of things that you would normally be able to enjoy, and difficulties with concentrating. So that's some of the behaviours that you might see in people or experience yourself if you're at risk of becoming unwell through a mood disorder. Some of the feelings that you might experience. And again, I won't read them all out, but change in mood and change in behaviour around how you're feeling. You may feel overwhelmed, you might be lacking in confidence, you might be feeling indecisive or unhappy. Now again, some of these things happen in the lead up to challenging circumstances. So exam times, it would be very normal for you to feel overwhelmed in that period because it's scary, it's new, there's a lot riding on things like that. So feeling overwhelmed from time to time, again, doesn't necessarily need to be a massive worry, but when you have a bunch of these feelings wrapped up together or you're experiencing them in circumstances where you wouldn't ordinarily feel that's an area to start having a flag and start having a conversation about. So two other areas to consider in mood disorder is some thoughts that you might think. I certainly experienced some of those myself, and certainly in colleagues or friends had people communicate those thoughts too. So things like nothing good ever happens, feelings of worthlessness, thoughts about life's not worth living. Now, that doesn't always mean that somebody who's thinking that is thinking about suicide, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But people can and do have thoughts of not feeling like life's worth living without having thoughts of suicide. But those are some thoughts to consider. So if you are feeling those yourself, we'll talk about the connections to support a little bit later on. Some of the physical things to think about as well, feeling more tired than usual, feeling run down, pains or physical pains where you might not necessarily get them, changes in your appetite and weight changes, and that could be increased or decreased weight dependent on your circumstances, but physical significant changes aren't always just a symptom of medical, like physical underlying conditions. It can be mental health related as well. So I'll pause for a breath there and check with Sam and the rest of the room around mood disorders. Is there anything that anybody wants to ask about those particular areas or have clarified or give me another compliment on that extent? Any of those things are open.
So we don't have any direct questions in the chat, Irene, but we've got good sharing of reflections that people can check in with. But yeah, I'm just having a look here at what the latest message has said. Yeah, I think it's all good to maybe keep going unless anybody
Perfect.
wants to ask a question. No, seems like we've got cricket, so we'll keep going. That's great.
Awesome. Oh, that's good. And again, and it's just not, and people see these things and they go, and I remember the first time I saw some of this information, I diagnosed myself with a generalized mood disorder in reading all the things, because at some point in my life I have absolutely thought I'm a failure, or I've been more tired than usual, or there's definitely aspects where you could go, I completely relate to that. And again, even if you are if you're experiencing any of these yourself at the moment and you are feeling like that relates to you, it does not mean you're destined to have a mental illness forever and that you're going to end up hospitalised and institutionalised. I'll talk about recovery and aspects of that towards the end of the presentation. But the point in telling you this is so that you can actually recognise it and seek support quickly, because the sooner that you get support around poor mental health, the sooner you get positive outcomes, and the better opportunities there are for good outcomes and good recovery through these things. So people can and do recover from mental illness. But again, I'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. But these are just really here to go, hey, if these things you're experiencing, or you see one of your community members experiencing them, that it might be worth a flag to step in. So I'm going to talk about substance use now. So just two slides on this. So substance use is where, if you think about the diagnostic terms that we talked about previously, for generalized mental illness, so that it has to impact on your cognitive process, and so the way you're thinking or experiencing things. It impacts on your capacity to manage day-to-day activities, and it's present over a period of time. This relates to substance use as well, but with substances, there's a couple of substance use disorder. There's a couple of different areas that impact. So at least two of the following aspects need to occur for it to be considered substance use, because you can use substances in a happy and healthy way. I'd question some of that later on when we talk about coping strategies, but people can and do use substances in a way that doesn't negatively impact them. When it becomes an impact, that's where it becomes harmful. So things to consider are if you're using substances, or your community members using substances, and they're starting to take them for longer amounts of periods and taking them in larger amounts than intended to. Now, I'm fairly sure, and many of us here will have said at some point, oh, I'm only going to go out for one drink on a Wednesday night because we've got something on a Thursday. And then we wake up on Thursday morning and we've been out till 4 o'clock at the club. I've definitely never ever done that in my life, but I know that that's normal human behaviour. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about an accidental hangover or something. It's about when it becomes longer and increasing periods where you're taking it for more than intended. Some of the other things to think about is if you want to cut down but you're struggling with that's a warning sign that things might not be going too well. Spending time trying to access substances if you're not able to get them. Repeated and negative issues. So if you're having regular arguments with your loved ones, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, or you're having lots of health events, or things like falling down and having to attend hospital, or waking up with bumps and bruises that you don't know where you've got them from. Those are a warning sign that substances might not be working too well for you. Again, I won't go through all of them there, but I'll talk about when we consider things to be harmful substance use. So I'll preface this slide with there are lots of really good 12-step programs and therapeutic programs for people who do intentionally use the term alcoholic to help people with their recovery. So I'm absolutely supportive that if people use 12-step programs such as Alcoholics Anonymous, the term alcoholic is used intentionally as a form of recovery. But in general, when we're talking about substance use now, we talk about substance-related harm. So we don't talk about somebody being an addict or an alcoholic or a druggie, or we try and stay away from negative terminology. And the rationale for that is there has been a perception in society previously where partly because the 12-step programs and the way that they've been portrayed in the press or in media is that if somebody has the definition of the term alcoholic, that means they have to be completely free from alcohol for the rest of their lives. Now, some people don't want to be free from alcohol. Some people do have substance-related issues and have harm related to that, but want to have a healthy relationship with the substance that they're using. And sometimes when we talk about terms like alcoholic, it stops people getting help or seeking help because they think that the only help that's available is the abstinence, complete abstinence, and that's just not the case. For some people it is, and for those people that is a perfectly fair and reasonable and ethical way of managing any kind of issues or harm related issues that you have. But for some people it's not. So we try and stay clear of those terms unless you're actually in a programme and you want to self-identify with that. I hope that makes sense to everybody, and I'm happy to talk about that if there is some questions in the chat. But what we focus on in terms of substance-related harms, we talk about the 4 L's. So liver, love, life, and law. And if you can say it really quickly after a glass of wine, then that's in a good place too, but maybe no more than 1 glass. So liver talks about health. So if you're having health-related impacts by using substances, that can be substance-related harm, and you might need to look at that and seek some support for it. So health's not just the falling and the bumps. It can be ongoing or chronic issues related to like legitimate liver or blood disorders or a whole bunch of things. But it can be as much as missing a couple of days' work because of your health and that impacting. Love, we talk about relationships, so that can be intimate relationships, non-intimate relationships, work colleagues, social friends, community connections. If those are being negatively impacted, then it can be substance-related harm. Life is your, as it says, work, hobbies. If your finances are struggling, if you're struggling to turn up for work, if you're struggling to engage in things that cause you enjoyment, or the things that cause you enjoyment are withdrawing from you because of the behaviours related with substance harm, then again, that can be a negative impact. And the 4th L is law. So if you're having legal issues related to substance uses, then it's a red flag that you probably need to connect with some support. Now, in this session, if you've got a loved one or a colleague or a community member who you can see that these things are impacting, there are some there's some standard ways that we can help you engage with talking to people. Now, we don't cover it significantly in this session because we've only really got an hour to talk about it, but we can do some follow-up. We'll give you some follow-up materials, and the majority of this content is taken from Mental Health First Aid Australia. So there, if you Google Mental Health First Aid Australia, there are some really good resources there for how you would communicate with people. The other resources that you can use, our UK website has lots and lots of engagement around how you then go about having a conversation with people. So that's 2 different resources you can use. I'm not personally endorsing any of them, but they've both been very helpful in the mental health space to try and engage people in conversations. So I'll pause there around the substance use one, and Sam, can you help? Are there any comments, questions?
Yeah, we've got some really generative comments, people sharing a lot of resources and kind of helpful tips and hints for our scholars, predominantly around most universities offer free access to counselling and psychologists through student wellbeing teams. So absolutely, use them if you feel it's suitable. One of the questions, Irene, is do substance use behaviours extend to non-tangible substances such as social media, gaming, pornography, media consumption, etc.? Or is that more considered a coping mechanism?
That's a great question.
Yeah,
I can answer it in a very general way. So when we talk about substances in the slides that I've talked about, and I'll go back to the ingestion of substances, we talk about substances that impact on our system. So the ingestion of, so things like taking longer periods in larger amounts and things like that. We are referring to areas that impact on our and I can't remember the word, but it's physical and it's our systems. So we're talking about the physical aspect. But what I'll say is that even if it's not a substance that you ingest, if something's causing you harm and it's linking to you not being able to function, if it's impact, like if you're removing yourself from your day-to-day life, or it's impacting on your cognitive process and your positive experiences of the world, and it's happening over a period of time, it is problematic. So it does require just the same amount of care and support as any other diagnosable mental illness. So there's not a massive amount of research at the moment about the environmental factors. We do know that they can cause harm, but social media in particular, and even the open access to pornography, which has really only been about the last 10 years where it's been widely available on the internet and relatively unfiltered. So there's access to actually quite a lot of traumatic material for people, and there's not significant research to that, and there isn't a lot of longitudinal studies on around it because it's relatively new. But what we do know in the short-term studies that are there is it can be just as harmful as any other area. So I hope that vaguely answers, probably doesn't answer your question, but answers in a way. But substance use is more about the chemicals that we're ingesting that impact on our central nervous system. Those were the words I forgot, central nervous system. The rest of it's more environmental, but if it's causing harm, it's causing harm. And my hope would be that if something's causing harm, people can access support for it to try and reduce the harm.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Irene. And the other thing I would add is that sometimes, if social media, other kind of addictive things do start getting in the way of your activities of daily living. So, that can be your ability to get up out of bed at a reasonable time, have a shower, breakfast, all of those things. And maybe it's about, getting some support around how to put boundaries around those things that are getting in the way of your activities of daily living. But I'll throw back to you now.
Oh, no, thanks, Sam. No, that's all very relevant. So what we're going to talk about now, and sorry about the timing of this, we've probably got about 6 or 7 more minutes of talking, and then we'll open it up to questions. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to talk about contributing factors. So there are some people who experience the poorer spectrum of mental health, and some people experience mental illness. And other people don't, and some people have quite adverse experiences where they don't go on to develop mental illness, and some people have adverse experiences that do. So I'm going to bring up a whole list of contributing factors now. Now that doesn't mean if you see one of these contributing factors up here that you're destined to experience diagnosable mental illness, but there is a risk factor attached to that, and the more of these experiences or factors that you have, the higher the risk is of contributing, and the higher the risk is of developing mental illness. And again, this isn't a big scary thing about, oh, you're destined to be in that space. It's about recognising that there's warning signs in areas that people might want to check in around some self-care or get some supports on. Now, these don't relate to absolutely everybody, but these are some of the things that come up for people. And one of the ones, so again, I'm not going to read through them. There are some biological areas that people who menstruate have that are different to people who don't. People who've had a baby, there is a significant physical trauma attached to that people who haven't had a baby won't experience. And those are some of the biological aspects that can link to some unique areas around mental illness. Others are more open to all members of the community. One of the ones that I really, and again, some of those are areas that anybody might experience. Some of them are more specific to others. The one I really struggled with was the personality type one, because I haven't explained my background, and I don't think it's necessary. I probably don't need to go through a massive amount of detail of it. But I was diagnosed with bipolar in my early 20s and had a few visits to the hospital and started working with health team. And when I read the area around personality type, I was actually quite confronted about that, because I thought, well, my mental illness is happening to me. I have absolutely no choice in what I'm experiencing, and the only way that I can manage it is through medication, because it's occurring to me. It's a chemical imbalance, and that chemical imbalance will be counteracted by medication. I'm going to do my first swear word now, but I found out that's total bullshit. And actually, there are a whole bunch of reasons why people experience mental illness, and that there's things that you can do personally to work through those. And I was really challenged by the personality type bit about some people who are more sensitive emotionally to experiences can be more at risk of developing mental illness. Now that sucks, because why not everybody? But there are some personality issues in there. Now that doesn't mean if you have a more sensitive type of personality that it's either your fault or that you are destined to become mentally ill. It's just something to consider, that there is a higher risk there. The other one I'll note is lack of exposure to bright light. Now, most Australians, for those of you who've grown up in Australia, probably won't even know what we're talking about with that. But some of us who are from the north of the globe, we in Scotland, you can have maybe 6 hours of daylight a day for periods of time in the winter, and having a lack of access to bright light can actually impact on your mood. Now, there's some strategies around that and some therapies around it, but generally in Australia, it's not one that impacts, unless, for example, you have work issues, like things like fly in, fly out workers who might be in the mines for longer periods of time and don't actually have access to light. There is a risk of lack of exposure to bright light for those people. So that's some of the contributing factors. My work is I'm the CEO of a mental health organisation that works with carers of people with mental illness. So we support the people who support people who are unwell. And caring for somebody in itself does have an increased risk of developing mental illness yourself. And that comes with some problematic factors as well, around people caring for a loved one, but then also not being able to care because they become unwell, or feeling guilty about becoming unwell because they're in a caring role. And it can all be wrapped up in some really challenging issues for family or relationship environments, where somebody wants to or feels like they need to be the strong one when actually they need some support themselves. So I'll pause for a breath there. Does anybody have any questions about the contributing factors? And then I'm going to talk about at-risk factors, and then I'm going to talk about LGBTIQ specific areas, and then I'm going to talk about support.
There's no questions in the chat, just a great deal of surprise, Irene, around 6 hours of daylight. You know, how awful that must have been. I don't blame you for, you know, moving to sunnier places.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I remember, and I'll very brief story. So I worked for the government back in Scotland, and it was a big grey building with blacked out windows. It was depressing in itself. And from October onwards in Scotland to round about end of February, early March, it starts to get light around 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, and starts to get dark around 3:30-ish. So if you're working in an environment, you might not see daylight apart from weekends or when you have days off. And I remember working for the government. It was a great job, but massively depressing environment. And Dino, who's here, Dino and I were together for a long time, and I really wanted to go to Australia because I grew up with Home and Away and Neighbours, and really wanted to live on the beach, because clearly Home and Away and Neighbours is exactly what Australian life's like. So I grew up wanting to be like that, and I remember talking to Dino about it and going, I'd really like to live in Australia one day. And I got a phone call from Dino in late October. It was bucketing down with rain. It was grey. And Dino said, I think I've got a job in Australia. It's in Brisbane. And I'd never heard of Brisbane before. And before they even finished the word Brisbane, I was like, yes, let's go. And that was it. And it was just such a flip to go, I just really want to escape this environment and come to somewhere Nice. Now, it turns out that coming to Australia didn't actually change my propensity to be mentally unwell and have negative experience. So I was very disappointed by that fact as well. Australia, you kind of let me down in that area. But it's interesting where the environment shifts and things can shift and change for you. So sorry for that little diversion there. But yeah, natural light can be a particular trigger too. So I'll move on to some of the more at risk communities if that's okay. So some of the areas where people are more at risk, and predominantly because of the contributing factors that we talked about in the last slide, and people's more likelihood because of environmental, socioeconomic and political factors that they might experience more areas of trauma. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people significantly at risk of developing ongoing mental health related areas, LGBTIQ plus community. Just a flag here, so and for those of you who want to are not comfortable, if you want to if you're not comfortable around stats around things, just mute your microphone for a minute. But the transgender community in particular are the highest rate of people who die by suicide and attempt to take their life by suicide of any community in Australia. So we know that men are higher risk and are disproportionately high in suicide. We know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are one of the key demographics of having poor mental health outcomes and death by suicide. But the transgender community are the highest in Australia. They're 15 times more likely than the general community to die by suicide. And that statistic hasn't changed in the 11 years that I've been here. And it hasn't changed in the longitudinal studies that we have when we started recording things about suicidality in the transgender community. And it's absolutely enraging that this is the one area and significant lack of financial support or public support from policymakers in this area. We do have some excellent resources, but the fact that we're still arguing about stuff like bathrooms and things like that, it's really quite enraging. Highest risk community in Australia. So I'll pause for a bit if people want to come back in, or Sam, if you're okay to put up in chat, we won't be talking about suicide now for a little bit. Other communities that are at risk, young people, so age 14 to 25, roughly about 50 to 75% of people who experience mental illness will experience it between those ages, but it's a higher risk area. People who are culturally and linguistically diverse. And again, if we go back to the contributing factors around lack of access to resources, lack of access to community, you can see where that occurs. And displaced communities, so just as an example, refugees or migrants, that can be an issue. People who experience long-term physical illness, and people who are retirees. So those are the predominantly more at-risk communities. And I'm just for the next two slides going to touch on LGBTIQ plus community. Sam, anything that we want to go on before we move on?
No, I think there's no questions in the chat, so we can keep going. But yeah.
All right, thank you. So contributing factors. So, and again, if I had a bit longer, we'd talk about these in a bit more detail, but I'm just going to give you some overlying areas. I'm going to talk about LGBTIQ specific barriers to access in a couple of slides, and some of it's overlap, so I'm just going to talk through this briefly. But the additional contributing factors to that many list of factors that we talked about a couple of slides ago. So there's some other areas that people in the LGBTIQ plus community experience that can have a negative impact on mental well-being. So some of the social and cultural influences, so even just lack of accessible role models or lack of accessible communities, not knowing who your community is, not knowing whether or not you can out yourself to people for safety, to be part of a community. In some areas in Australia, just lack of physical community, like it just doesn't exist. Misconceptions around faith or actual conceptions around organised religion and religious messaging around that. Now, I'm certainly absolutely people who are LGBTIQ plus have faith, and people who have faith are not homophobic. There are some right-wing areas that don't really do religion or faith any kind of service, and I'm certainly not challenging anybody who does have faith or experience faith or live by it. There are lots and lots of inclusive options there, but when you see the media that Australia in particular experiences, you tend to get a lot of anti or LGBTIQ plus or negative perceptions around that, which also doesn't help when people do have faith, because they tend to drop away from their faith, and that could be something that could help keep people secure and connected to the community. So it's a double whammy there. The assumption of people being heterosexual and cisgender, another contributing factor, even just not even having to explain yourself, but people just assuming you are in a particular way when you're not. Coming out is another contributing factor. It can also be a factor of not accessing supports. For some people, coming out can be a really invigorating and positive experience. It can be self-affirming. There are many, many wonderful things to coming out, but for people where it's a contributing factor to your negative mental health, for some people it can be incredibly traumatic. It is bloody exhausting doing it over and over and over again. I'm kind of lucky that probably because of the way that I look, most people just assume that I'm gay now, and I kind of don't have to do it anymore. But it can be quite exhausting when, even if people ask you, do you know, like asking the binary, do you have a husband? Go, oh, I'm going to have to go through this again, and what's your response going to be like? Can be incredibly traumatic for people. Even so, the homosexual, trans, or biphobia, I do want to talk about this, and I'd prefer to do this face to face to see people's reactions. But in the LGBTIQ community, there is internalized phobia in the community as well. I'm hoping some of you are nodding and going, oh yeah, I can see that. I wish none of you were, because I wish that it didn't exist. But if you think about some of the political movements, or some of the movements around anti-trans areas within the LGBTIQ community themselves, there are areas like that. And I remember biphobia being quite a big deal when I was growing up, which was only about 6 or 7 years ago, of course. But like, people didn't understand what bisexuals were. There was all the nonsense that you hear about, you're only bisexual because you haven't met the right blah, or you just want your cake and eat it. Well, who doesn't want their cake and eat it? What's the point of having cake if you're not going to eat it? But it's just ridiculous things to say about people. And I think sometimes the community is getting better at being more inclusive, but there are still exclusionary areas. And that in itself is another double impact to mental well-being. So if you're in a community where you feel you should be safe, and it should be the safest community that you're in, and you're experiencing exclusion in the place where you should belong, that's another additional crucial impact to poor mental well-being. And the institutionalized discrimination are some of the things, again, that we'll talk about around barriers. So things like some of the ridiculous questions that you get asked in forms, or binary bathrooms where they're not necessary, things like that, where you just go, they don't need to exist, but they do, and it's in your face. And even if it's not a big issue for you, it's small areas where it just chips away at people's self-esteem and sense of self-worth. So I'll move on quickly to LGBTIQ plus health in 2021. And I'm just going to give you a warning here. The next slide, which we'll just talk about for about 90 seconds, does talk about suicide again. So if that's something that's going to be challenging for you, I just ask you to take a step away for the next maybe just 60 to 90 seconds. If you do feel safe in this environment, please stay. Happy to talk through, but I'm just going to talk about some statistics. So that's all. We're not going to talk about any details around anything like that. So just some stats and the likelihood. But again, for some people that can be quite challenging. So some of the statistics, and there's a hyperlink in this. Now, a couple of years ago, I had a graphic on LGBTIQ plus health, and it was one that it's a graphic that was taken from 2016, just around some generic health related issues. Now, I've looked at the same resource again this year, and I've put it in the hyperlink, but it's about 10 pages, and I'm really pleased to see that the studies are much more inclusive around transgender or non-binary people, people who are asexual, talks about intersex, and they're very specific about lots of details and the statistics around health. Now, I can't cover them all in the course of this slide, but if you're interested in the health outcomes and the mental health outcomes for people in the LGBTI community, and it's not nice reading because it is more negative, the hyperlinks at the bottom. So just in general, people in the LGBTIQ plus community are 2.5 times more likely to be diagnosed or treated for a mental health condition. And again, suicide attempts 5 times more likely, transgender people 15, which I get the rage when I hear that. So yeah, it's very unpleasant and absolutely awful that it's not been decreased or just wiped out completely. People in the LGBTIQ plus community self-harm 4 to 6.5 times more likely, dependent on your circumstances. Depression 6 to 7 times more likely, anxiety 3 to 5.5 times more likely, and in general psychological distress 3 times more likely. So the reason I'm saying this is not to put a dampener on your induction weekend or to go, fuck, it sucks that we're in the community and how do we manage this? It's to make sure that you're aware that the risks are there so that you can access the supports, or be aware that there are issues with being part of the LGBTIQ plus community that make you more at risk and more likely to need to receive supports. So sorry if it's incredibly depressing, but it's done with the element of care that we want you to try and engage in supports as early and as often as you can to reduce the likelihood of any harm. So for anybody who wants to come back in now, we're not going to talk about anything else that should be challenging, so people are welcome to come back. I'm going to talk about access and supports now, and Sam, I'd love your help with some of this and some of the comments that people are putting on the slide. So I'm just going to talk for a little bit about the top 3 areas that people might access, and then if people do want to chip in, and Sam, if you're happy to talk through some of that would be great. Absolutely. So some of the areas where you can access support, and in general, but not for everybody, my non-professional advice would be GPs are one of your first points of call to access support. General practitioners, if you access them, can help you get access to things like a mental health care plan, which can give you either reduced or no cost access to mental health supports for a period of time. I won't give you the exact details because they keep changing, and with COVID you get even more supports now if something's COVID related. So there are many different aspects to that. But a general practitioner, if they're good, should go through areas like physical health as well, because some of the signs and symptoms of poor mental health or mental illness can be linked to physical areas as well. So a good GP will talk you through all of that. They'll do a bit of a mental health assessment. It's normally a few questions on how often you've been feeling a particular way, and then they'll help access you to the right support. You can, of course, self-refer to areas like a psychologist. Generally, a psychiatrist would take a referral from somebody else. But I do want to talk just very, very briefly on the difference between psychologists and psychiatrists, partly because I got them mixed up when I was young and I didn't have a great experience with it, and I want to help you avoid that. So psychologist is normally a talk therapist, so they studied psychology, and even if they go on to study a more clinical area, they generally tend not to be medical practitioners. So it's normally a therapy related support, which is around talking, helping you work through your thoughts and feelings, helping you manage your behaviours, and we'll work with you on these areas. Psychiatrists are a medical doctor first, who then goes on to study psychiatry, and generally psychiatrists are involved because there's an additional need for medical support with your mental health needs. Now, not always, but in general that's there. Because they both begin with psych, some people get them mixed up. And with a psychologist, you're likely to have first session, maybe an hour and a half, ongoing sessions, comfy sofa, probably a nice glass of water, nice smelling room, tissues, all of those things. And the psychologist is going to make you feel safe and comfortable and help you talk about what's going on. The psychiatrists might do that as well, but I remember doing this session a few years ago down in Sydney, and I don't know if Richard's still one of our members, but Richard's a psychiatrist, and I said, and I'm sorry for any psychiatrists in the room, but sometimes psychiatrists or psychiatry, because they're focused on the medical aspect, they don't always get the bedside manner and the TLC bit right. And Richard kind of went, yeah, okay, that's fair enough, we do that. And we'd like to change it. Now, that's not everybody, and it doesn't mean you're going to get a cold psychiatrist, but you might expect more of a medical appointment, or more of a looking at your signs and symptoms and reduction of them through care rather than ongoing support. And I remember when I first started seeing I had to see a psychiatrist because I was prescribed quite strong medication when I first had my diagnosis. And I'd been seeing a psychologist for a while, and it was lovely and cozy and warm and working on my stuff, and she was absolutely there for me. I went to see the psychiatrist, and she read a bit of paper, didn't even look at me, went, "You're not taking your meds." And I was about to do this, oh, but here's why, and they don't make me feel good, and all of this stuff. And she just pushed the paper aside and went, "Don't come back until you're ready to start working with me." And that was the session over. Now, that was 25 years ago, so things have changed since then, but it's the reason I'm sharing it with you is so that you, if you or whoever it is you might be sharing about what options of support there is a very different experience you'll get. Now, it should still be a positive experience, but don't expect the same thing from a psychologist and a psychiatrist. So I hope that makes sense. What I'll do is I'm not going to go through the rest of them, but from understanding in your chat, you've actually had some really good chats about supports. Sam, are you happy to talk through some of those for a while?
Yeah, absolutely. On the Pinnacle Foundation website, we do have a resource page which links into some resources. The other good one for our community, I find, is QLife. So from 3 p.m. till midnight, they operate a telephone counselling service as well as web chat. So that's staffed by volunteers from our community. I find that sometimes having a resource like QLife can just cut through maybe some of the explaining of, situations that we all just understand as, sometimes hard to go through or damaging. Whereas if you're having to explain that to a GP who's maybe not from our community, that can feel like a little bit of kind of education when you're unwell, which is not ideal. So QLife, I think, is one of the really key ones that I'd love all of our scholars to be aware of and reach out to should they feel they need support. I'm also happy to have supportive conversations with people so I can help them work out what resources might be best for them based on the state and territory that they are in. So although I can't kind of, work as a counsellor with you, because that's not what I do at the Pinnacle Foundation, and we're an education charity, I'm more than happy to use some of the contacts and networks that I have to find really inclusive and affirming supports in the state and territory that you're in if you feel like you need that. Because I think the key thing with regards to mental health for our community is that you have to be able to trust the person that you're engaging with. Without that trust, it makes it really, really challenging to have a beneficial therapeutic relationship. So I would always suggest that people don't kind of hold on to things. They reach out to either family, friends, or Pinnacle family, because there's so much support available out there to you. So that's kind of what I would say on resources. Pinnacle Foundation website, and then also QLife. And if that's not helpful, reach out to me. Okay.
Cool. Thanks, Sam. So what I'll do now, just a couple more slides. I'm going to talk, so these are the areas that we can access, and I want to talk very briefly about the barriers to access, and the reason for mentioning those is so that you're aware of them and that we can help reduce them if possible. This is just an unnecessary slide that I'd normally do face-to-face, and then we'd ask some questions and have a bit of to and fro, but I'm going to skip past that one. So the barriers to access and support, so for anybody in the general community, there are barriers in particular around mental illness. So some of them are around stigma around what mental illness is, what it means for people, whether or not they think that it's going to impact on work or relationships. Some people don't want to disclose. Now, I work in I'm I'm in a mental health organisation, I'm the CEO, and I'm very open about my mental health experiences, predominantly because I want my employees to be just as open when they need support. But even still, even though I'm completely open about it, I try and use it often when I'm talking in situations with the teams around we're struggling at the moment, especially around COVID, and people still don't want to raise it with us because they're worried that they'll lose their jobs. No, I hope it's not the environment that we've created in the organisation. I think it's a societal ingrained expectation that if you become unwell, you're gonna be locked in a hospital, you're not going to be able to work again, you're never going to be able to do those things. And that does stop people from accessing support because they just don't want to be in that space. Some of the other areas are lack of knowledge of where to access support, financial. There can be regional areas where there's just no supports available apart from online supports. There was the Productivity Commission for Mental Health supports that came out last year. There was a big push for financially supportive around online supports, but online supports aren't always available for people. Like if you're living in an environment where you can't be open or out with your family and you need supports and it's only online, it actually presents risk to you as well. So online's not the be all and end all of everything, but that can be an issue for people accessing supports. Some of the more LGBTIQ specific areas, and Sam, you touched on them, I think like knowledge and competency of people, like if a doctor or a practitioner isn't aware of LGBTIQ needs and supports, they might end up actually traumatizing you or creating more issues than not. Even with physical aspects, if people are not aware, you know, like asking about genitals or are you having sex and things like that without being nuanced about what that means for an individual and what that means for their body. Some of the areas around having to educate people whilst receiving supports, and we get that a lot with even just having people try to explain or being asked to explain pronouns, or can you tell me more about why, rather than just accepting and going, you're telling me what you need from me and I'm going to give it back to you. There's the please explain. And sometimes that happens for really genuine, authentic reasons where people want to learn and they want to do better, but it's still exhausting if you have to do it on a regular basis. Um, the forms that ask about sex or gender when not required can be quite confronting for people, and especially if they're online now where you can't get past the male female, but like it's a mandatory question and you can't fill out the rest of the form, and then it actually can stop people from accessing it completely. I've been in the room with somebody who went, stuff it, not doing that because that's not who I am, and that's stopping people from accessing genuine supports that they might need. Parental awareness or consent or even family awareness can be challenging as well, especially if you need family support to access areas. So that's some of the more LGBTIQ specific ones as well. And it's something to think about from if you're a mentor in the room and you're working with your scholar and they're not travelling well, that might be some other areas to consider around the barriers and having a chat with them about it. Scholars, if you're working with your mentor and they're not travelling well, same. If you're experiencing this yourself, being aware that there are some specific reasons for barriers and informing yourself about who might be more appropriate people to get support from. But also if somebody in your community is experiencing this, that's another area to consider. Now we're running out of time. We've got about 8 minutes, I think, and I've probably talked too long. So I'm just going to go through. I've got 2 more slides to do, and then we'll open up to a chat. So support in a crisis. I'll leave this slide with you, but my general take home from this is don't wait until it's a crisis. We've given you quite a bit of resources just now to go, here's some red flags or here's some warning signs that I might not be travelling well. Don't wait till it becomes a crisis, because the earlier you get in there and support, and all of the research backs this up, the earlier you get support, the better the outcome you have. Now, that doesn't mean if you're in a crisis and you haven't sought support that the world's going to end. It does not mean that, but you do, the chances are you've got better outcomes if you get support earlier on. So I'll leave that slide up there just now. The make a plan bit is linked to the last sentence there, the make a plan bit's linked to your plan that you'll work with Sam on, but I'll just go on to the next slide quickly around recovery and hope. So I have talked about some really challenging and negative areas here, but I do want to kind of end with some hope for recovery and hope for the future. And recovery doesn't mean, it can mean different things to different people. Sometimes when people become unwell, their life does fundamentally change forever. Now that doesn't mean it changes for the worst. It can actually improve, or it just becomes different. So when we talk about recovery, we don't mean back to same old where you were before things started to not travel well. Some people have different definitions of recovery, like there's medical where it's free from symptoms. I'm not going to go through all of those, but just to say that recovery can and does exist. Significant longitudinal research, even around people who have probably more of the extreme signs and symptoms of mental illness. People who experience psychosis can and do recover and can be free from any negative impacts on mental illness. But I just want you to look, you've got a bunch of peers in the room today, and the statistics are probably 1 in 5 people now we're talking about this. Probably 50% of Australians at some point in their life have had experiences of mental illness. When I was in my 20s, hospitalised quite a few times, had real periods of being unwell, very fortunate to survive a suicide attempt when I was 11. And I really did think for a period of time that that would be my life, and that's how it was. But through quite a lot of hard work and quite a bit of denial in certain periods of time and experiencing some of the things that you should or shouldn't do, working through it, I am in a place where I've been happy, healthy and well for many, many years. I'm in a job that I enjoy a reasonably, I don't know if CEO and NGO is actually a very impressive job, but like in an area where I'm able to impact and influence others and can talk about my lived experience in a positive way around it. I share that with you not because I want to talk about myself, but you can have periods, people can and do recover from absolutely wanting to die and having a plan that if life doesn't get better to end their lives at particular points, to being happy, healthy and well and being free from symptoms, for being free from negative impacts. So I want to share that with you because I am not the only one in the room that will have had this experience. I'm fairly confident about that. If anybody wants to share theirs, they're more than open to, and Sam, I'll open up to you in a second, but there will be mentors in the room who've experienced these things. There will be scholars in the room, and there are many, many people in the community that are walking amongst you who have had experiences of recovery. And I hope that if you are in this position or you're talking to somebody who is in a position of not being well, that you can share those stories of hope that people can and do recover, because that's one of the areas that will help people work through their challenges. So I'll open over to Sam. Are you happy to just add a little bit to that, and then we'll open up to questions? And I might shove the slideshow off now so I can see people's faces if they're comfortable doing that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's get it going as the Brady Brunch screen, hey? I think, Irene, that presentation was just such a brilliant, really broad overview of some of the kind of mental illnesses that are just way too common in our community. And I suspect that there's a great deal of insider knowledge within this room about how we manage and overcome kind of difficult mental health experiences that, can transpire into mental illness if we're not doing things around them. Just in the kind of last little bit around resources and support, I neglected to mention that something that I do as part of the ongoing work as my role as scholar and mentor manager with the Pinnacle Foundation is every fortnight I run a kind of national online Teams group just like this called Queer Chat for all of our scholars. So that place is really intended for mutual support and self-help on a peer level, because I think peer support is really impactful in terms of helping us manage and overcome some of the all too prevalent experiences in our community. I want to open it up maybe to any questions or reflections that other people in the room might have, because yeah, I want to kind of have some different voices in the mix if possible. And yeah, are there any people who have got questions for Irene maybe, or remarks about things that resonated with them at all?
Thank you, Irene, but I also wanted to thank everyone else for the chat and for the resources that they've been posting, because I've just found about 3 new services that I feel like I want to use. So that's been really helpful as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Caitlin. And I'm just looking at them now. I couldn't see them when I was doing the presentation. I'm actually pretty overwhelmed at the amount of information that you're all sharing with each other, and I hope it reinforces the community aspect that we're all in this together. Yeah, and just on the chat, I'm absolutely disgusted that we don't have an allied connection. I think it's something that not Pinnacle but society should have, something where it's easily read that there's safe spaces to go rather than relying on the community to do that themselves. So I absolutely feel you on that, and I can see some of the experiences some people have had there that sound quite traumatic, in particular around the medical aspects. I'm really sorry to hear that. I wish I could do something more about it in terms of that, but I'm just going to acknowledge your trauma and difficulty with it, and I appreciate that this presentation won't resolve all of that, but I hope at least we can help find some connections for you through this. So, anyway, thank you.
And I think we certainly have a few scholars and also mentors who are medical professionals that have kind of expressed to me, either during their interview or conversations that we have, that they're dedicated to making healthcare more trans and gender diverse and inclusive, as well as, broadly LGBTI inclusive. So I'm so glad that we have scholars that are, going through their studies and so willing to walk the walk as well as talk the talk, in terms of having some of those difficult conversations in maybe, kind of big organizations where there needs to be systemic change to uplift some people in our community. So it's just so brilliant that we, have all of you here to, kind of go back to that pinnacle theory of change that I mentioned earlier, to create a more inclusive society for LGBTIQ people.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm a lesbian and a psychiatrist, and I'm
sorry, Maria, about the psychiatrist comments.
No, Irene, I'm really dismayed, but actually not entirely surprised by your comments, because working on the inside and living in the community, I see it from both sides. I work as a mentor. So for all of the scholars, I would encourage you to be aware that there will be a mixture of psychiatrists you will come across, and the medical profession is generally much more conservative than it likes to admit. I know the College of Psychiatry is trying to get a conversation going about creating a section that can talk to the media a little bit more, and there's an interesting series of conversations going around that. But for scholars, if you're seeking out and need to seek out a psychiatrist, or would like to seek out a psychiatrist, recognise that you're the customer, and you have a right to pick somebody who you trust and can form a relationship with and feels is respectful and is listening to you, and all of those things. There are lots of good psychiatrists out there who understand that.
Oh, absolutely, thank you, Maria. And I hope, and if I can change my presentation in a way that's a bit more psychiatry inclusive, I'm happy to do that, and I'm happy to take some feedback offline. But I hope it wasn't anything that felt like an attack. Obviously,
I'm well aware
it's psychiatry.
Mixed. I'm well aware it's very, very mixed, and there are quite queerphobic psychiatrists still out there, and psychiatrists of a great variety of styles. So I just wanted to make sure that scholars were aware that there's still a very viable pathway forward for people who need psychiatry.
Yeah, and then also I think the Australian Psychological Society website is a great resource to find psychologists who are LGBTI inclusive. So you can literally use that as a little tick box for the psychologists that you do want to find in your area, and it has you can select up to, I think, 3 to 5 kind of topics that are important in the psychologists that you want to find. So there are always more inclusive professionals from our community across these disciplines, and yeah, it is good to seek help. I think there was some comments about, you know, how engaging in therapy throughout your life is just a helpful thing to do. There might be times where you need to engage in a level of psychological support more consistently than just as a one-off. So absolutely, if you're struggling, please reach out to me or your mentor or anyone in the Pinnacle family, because we're so willing to guide you in the direction of who might be the right person for you to work with.
Can I jump in as well, Sam? I'm a psychologist and I'm a mentor as well, and I just want to echo what Maria said, that there are varying levels of understanding and lived experience among psychologists as well, and that psychology in general is quite a privileged profession, and it's you know, it's a very competitive sort of field, and that means that obviously the most privileged are the ones who become psychologists, and that has inherent problems. So, but I would just really want to encourage everyone here, and our scholars in particular, to if you have a not so good experience where you feel like you don't fit with a psychologist, is to keep trying, because it really can be like a bit of a trial and error process, a bit of a speed dating kind of process of like finding the right fit for you. I mean, I've been through myself lots of psychologists in my life trying to find the right people for me, and that's okay. And psychologists get that as well. Like, it's okay that sometimes we're not the right people for you. So yeah, just really encouraged to keep trying. I know it's really hard, but try to keep trying if you can.
Yeah, no, I'd echo that, Monica. Yeah, I think it took me until I've probably seen about 5 or 6 psychologists and 2 psychiatrists, and it took me till my late 30s to get one that actually really connected and helped me work on my own stuff as well. And that was the relationship that actually pushed me. And I think you're right, you have to find someone that works for you, not worry if you leave them and they get upset with you, because that's not how it I'm sure they'll be just as happy for you if you move on to something that actually works for you.
That all of the advice that we've had kind of shared with us throughout this session, I think, is so brilliant in terms of yeah, finding supports for when we have the wobbly moments in life, because they do happen. So thank you so much, Irene, for your presentation. It was just absolutely sensational. I really cannot thank you enough, and I hope that all of our scholars and mentors enjoyed it as much as I did. I think in terms of the agenda, we are running a bit over time, which is, you know, means that we're having great discussions. So maybe we shall have is it a quick break, or are we jumping to
It's a quick break, and we're going to pick up in 10 minutes for our final session. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, and I will be sharing the resources in the chat as well for everybody.
And Paula, just before I log off, Sam, thank you for that, and thank you everybody for listening. What I always like to do at the end, because it is quite a heavy subject, is I like to end on a joke, just to leave you with something more humorous. And I think this one's like, so, and if you know it, don't shout it out, because it just ruins it for me. And it is my only joke that I have. So I'll leave you with, what did the fish say when it swam into a wall? Damn. So
I am absolutely thrilled and excited to share with you the engaging and amazing speaker that is Dr. Cassandra Goldie. You are all in for such an amazing treat. Oh, I just can't wait to get started. Over to you.
Thank you, Paula, and Andrew. It's really so gorgeous to see you and to have been invited into this really special couple of days for the Pinnacle family. I'm Cass Goldie. I want to acknowledge that I'm here on country. That I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I really want to pay respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants in the weekend here this afternoon. I have the great privilege of actually being just near the beautiful Sydney Harbour. Many of you no doubt were involved in activism associated with Invasion Day a few days ago, and may this be the year that we deliver better justice and self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and let's get that referendum going on the voice to Parliament. So look, I'm aware that this is a really special couple of days for the new scholars coming into Pinnacle, and it's a real privilege, really is a privilege. I was so excited to be invited to spend a bit of time with you this afternoon, and I really want to thank you as the Pinnacle scholars. Every time I've connected with the scholars associated with Pinnacle, I get really inspired, and I know that this has been a long couple of years of sitting on various online platforms and Zoom, and but I really want to assure you that this is totally worth it, and that from my observations and experience of being involved with Pinnacle so far, that I've got the privilege of witnessing you begin to write the next part of your story and your history. So look, I just want to share first of all a little bit about myself. I was born on Noongar land, which is Perth. I'm assuming we've got some fabulous people from WA in the program. I don't know how I feel about my family in WA right now. They do not want me back. I'm aware of that. I've got a medical family and they're all very happy to see the borders closed at this time. And so I'm waiting to get back in. So special hello to my extended family from WA that's not a part of this program today. Look, I was adopted at birth, and I was adopted into a white middle class family with very working class roots. So my parents and my family would be described by Scott Morrison probably as the quiet Australians, very white bread, very sort of conservative, very modest aspiration. So fast forward to today, and well, so I've come out as a lesbian. That's nothing new these days. I tried to get arrested in Darwin unsuccessfully. I'm still waiting to get arrested. I've cycled in Alaska and nearly got attacked by a grizzly bear. I've studied in London. I went to the G20 in Russia. I've rafted down the Franklin River in Tasmania. I've been on Q&A. That was pretty scary. That's probably the most scary thing I've actually done. I'm going to back anybody else who's done something like that. That was freak out time. And I've also had the privilege of being involved in a lot of activism and really special work alongside and supporting people who are really wanting to make a difference and to make local communities and, you know, the bigger world a much better place, really demanding it, you know, tackling some of the harder stuff, poverty and inequality, and responding to the climate crisis. And so in that sort of work, I've been involved in things like parliamentary inquiries, been to the UN, grassroots campaigns, up and down protesting with people with disability, that kind of activity, and been involved very much in a lot of the law reform work that many of you have probably been a part of, including for our communities. So I've had to leave jobs because of discrimination, and I got jobs because of who I am. What else? Well, I've had my heart broken just a few times, and I've also fallen in love just a few times. So today, my job is as CEO of ACOSS, which is the peak body for the community sector. And the core purpose of ACOSS is to tackle poverty and disadvantage and to build an Australia where everybody's treated with respect and to get to lead a really dignified life. And so it is in that work that I've really been able to work with extraordinary people and seeing what it takes, the courage and determination that it takes to stand up against sometimes very vitriolic, nasty, experiences, and also governments that are determined to turn their back over and over and over again. And so I guess in the work that I've done and the roles that I've been involved in, it's been a strong theme about social justice and standing up. I guess for me, the touchstone typically is sort of about a fundamental human rights-based activism. But I do from time to time, there are days when I will ask myself, why did I not choose to lead a quieter life? And there has certainly probably, like yourselves, been those days over the last couple of years where you go, maybe I want to not do some of that today. Maybe I just want to stay in bed today. Maybe I don't really want to turn up. And so asking why is actually a really useful thing, I think, sometimes to understand who we are and what motivates us. And for me, because I have had the opportunity to reflect on this a bit, and Andrew and Paula know this well now, really it goes back very much to my early beginnings as a kid. So my dad he's still alive, he's just clocked 100 years old. Yes, so work that out, everybody. He was a veteran of the Second World War. And you probably would know it because he's a very stoic human, but behind that, that Second World War experience had a really profound and very damaging experience on my dad. And behind the closed doors of a sort of our family home when I was a kid, I would often sit with my dad on the couch as we watched TV. But it wasn't the ordinary kind of TV that you'd expect to be sitting watching with your dad. He would sit with me as we watched various programs about the Holocaust. So I was quite young, but he would share with me the experience of the death camps, of Auschwitz, of the rise of Hitler, of what it meant, the mass killings of millions of people who were considered the other, people of the Jewish faith, people with a disability, people of colour, and people like us, our communities. And it's kind of an unusual thing for a parent to do, don't you think? But actually, I'm very grateful to him because what he helped me to understand as a very young person was that we are all capable of doing anything given a certain set of circumstances, and that life is also extremely precious. As human beings, we can do extraordinary things in the face of the worst, and we can do the worst things if we are placed in the wrong set of circumstances. So I do think that it wired into me from a very young age, this kind of vigilance, that sense of a responsibility to stand up against injustice and to watch the small moments, to not let them go by, how important it is for us as communities to be there for the small moments when it's wrong and to say we're not going to put up with that in every move we make. So that notion of actually it is up to us about how we shape the next stage of history, which of course is both a weight, but it's also really exciting to remember that, the power that each of us have. And so, look, there's a lot of, I remember as a kid kind of experimenting with what that meant for me, but it was really only when I came out, my own personal coming out story with my family, that I experienced my own version of discrimination and what it meant to have others stand up for me. And of course, that is really confronting and very profound. My coming out story was not fab at all. And so when I became involved in the Pinnacle Foundation, I was really struck by how powerful it is, this sense of Pinnacle creating and offering you a sense of family. I paused for just a moment when Andrew first talked to me about that, but it really touched me, and I realised what an important promise that is about creating a sense of safety and a sense of place. And I really want to assure you, as the scholars coming in 2022, particularly after the couple of years that you've all been through and we've all been through together, to assure you that Pinnacle takes that promise very, very seriously. Because for too many of us, our experience of discrimination cuts most deeply amongst our original families, our parents or extended family who are meant to have our back. They're the ones who are meant to love us the most and to love us unconditionally, to infinity and beyond. But when I fell in love with a woman for the first time, I felt clearly I had to keep that secret. I had to keep it secret from my original family for months. It was not a celebration. I knew that deep down. I knew instinctively the seismic shift when I came out would have, the ricocheting effect that it would have through my kind of family and my kind of extended family. I was blissfully in love. You know that one, yeah? But I also knew that when I came out, it would change everything. But my dear mum, who is also still alive at 97, she is relentless. And so after a few months, she sprung me. But what followed for me was pretty brutal. I will never forget sitting on the porch with my dad when I shared with him that I was in love. And he said to me that I was the devil and that he would never touch me again. And for the next 20 years, my father would never allow me to bring my partners into the family home. But to this day, I also recall when my mum, in her 70s at the time, asked me when I first came out in a very matter-of-fact kind of way, one of the first things she wanted to ask me was whether or not I used a false penis. And I want to tell you, she is the only person who has actually ever just come out in a first chat and asked me that question. And I love her. I love her for that. Look, so now I have a very diverse family. Adopted, I was in my 20s when I first met my birth mother and my other brother, Daniel, and my sister, Chelsea. We'd lost touch. I was not in contact with them until I was in love with my first love. And so we were out and about in Perth at the Court Hotel for Perth Friends on this. You'll know it. I think it's still doing that thing. And so I was going up the stairs, and coming down the stairs was this very cool dude in a rainbow waistcoat. Remember those? And I looked up, and it was my brother, Daniel. And I went, Daniel, what are you doing here? And he turned around and he says, well, this is my boyfriend. And he said, come upstairs. I've got somebody else for you. I went upstairs, and who was sitting in the corner with her girlfriend but my sister Chelsea? So I have, out of my 3 siblings, 2 of my siblings are also queer. Daniel and Brian got married in South Africa before marriage equality. That was very special. And thank you to all of you who were involved in the campaign to deliver marriage equality in Australia. It really matters. It mattered to my sister Chelsea and Janet, who had been together for over 20 years when they finally got married. And that was a very, very beautiful thing. But the reality is, for me, my closest family is the family that I have created over those years. My dearest friends and the loved ones that I have chosen. They're the people that have walked with me through the really tough times, the people who really got it, as well as the party times, and people who've had my back, cheer me on in both those good times and bad. And you know the people in your lives who are your family in that way. And again, I know Andrew and Paula and everybody at Pinnacle says that that is part of what, and Sam, that is what is being offered to you to extend your family out through Pinnacle. Look, I just want to say, for some of us, I think being a person from our communities will be a really big part of who you are as you move through the world. For others, it may not be. Like my sister Chelsea is just kind of, yeah, it's off the side. She's just who she is. And for me, it's probably a bit of both. But I assure you, I wouldn't change who I am. I wouldn't have chosen the discrimination and the pain that I've sometimes experienced when I've learned so much from it as a result. Look, years ago, I was shocked when someone told me, I was working at Legal Aid in WA at the time, that everyone was saying that the reason I'd got the promotion at Legal Aid was because I'd slept with the female director of Legal Aid. And that apparently, if you wanted to get a job in my section, by that stage I was a manager, if you wanted to get a job in my section of Legal Aid, you had to sleep with me. Well, the Legal Aid director was very straight, and yes, I have been very proud to have employed, over the time I've had the privilege to employ people, extraordinary people who happen to be from our communities because they're fabulous at their job. But I won't deny that I had to overcome those moments. But overcoming those moments, it taught me a very great lesson that often these kinds of attacks are not in the end about our sexuality or our gender identity at all. That often it's just an attempt to distract us from our task as we push forward as who you are as an individual, as who you are as a part of a community, or as who we are as part of a determined community to make the world a better place. And it's during those times that we can really use, this is my view, the power of the high road. Staying focused, being kind, being determined to go for the goal that you want to achieve, to go for it, and to really be proud of who you are. Be proud of who you are. I just want to, in the last little bit, talk a bit about the privilege of education and this scholarship. As I said at the beginning, and I really mean it, I just, you know, there are those moments, and my instinct is that this is a moment for many of you about writing the next stage of your own history, your story, and you will make out of this scholarship what is right for you. And I'm able to look back and I really know the profound difference that having a great education made for me. I talked at the beginning about my family of origin, and actually it took me a long while to realise that I was one of the first, I think still the only of my generation of my extended family that got a formal tertiary education. And I only found out quite recently, in fact, Andrew and Paula, since I gave the first speech of this weekend, I only found out very recently from my birth mother that as she decided to give me away as a baby, the one condition she'd put on it was that I was to get a tertiary education. And that was actually, because my father is a bit of a steely old bugger, I don't think I would have got access to the tertiary education at that time if it hadn't been for the voice and the long hand of my birth mother as she left me in that hospital all those years ago. So I have had a great education. I've been privileged enough to get a degree and then a master's, and then I did go on to get a PhD. And look, just before the borders got locked down for us here in Australia, I managed to go overseas, and I did my master's over in London a long time ago, and I was very lucky to have connected them with a professor who really changed my world by getting me into that master's program and looking out for me. And I tracked him down just a couple of years ago. So it was over 30 years later, William Twining. Yes, he's very old. I didn't even know, Sam, whether he was actually alive. You know, I had to kind of go, is he still there? And he's still there in his little, very Oxford professor style. And I went and I saw him, and we went to a local little pub, and I asked him to sit down, and I said, I just want to say a few things to you. And I said to him how profoundly different my life had been because of him, and that he had changed my life. I really wanted him to know that. It was my own experience about the value of the financial support. He gave me work at the time, and also the personal relationships and the doors that he opened for me absolutely are the reason that I have the privilege of hanging out with you guys today. My life would have been very different without him, and I wanted him to know that. Look, Australia is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. I'm not saying that the experience of what's going on in Australia is great for everybody. It's not. And actually, as we've seen the ravages of COVID unfold in the last couple of years, there's no question that some people with wealth and with power and privilege are doing actually extraordinarily well. And then there are other people, younger people, people with insecure paid work, for whom this has been hellish as an experience. And it may be that that's kind of describing some of the experience for some of you here this afternoon. As you might have lost jobs, as you couldn't pay your rent, and as the economic supports came and went for us here in Australia. And there is no excuse, in my view. As the second wealthiest country in the world, we demonstrated in the first year of COVID that we actually could end poverty virtually overnight when social security payments were increased, and we protected people in many cases from being evicted when you couldn't afford to pay your rent. And so today and over the next month, I'll be involved with many other people. In fact, we're lobbying for insiders tomorrow to talk about poverty and disadvantage and what an alternative Prime Minister in Anthony Albanese might do if he gets the power to change people's lives. And I want to acknowledge that for younger people, people on youth allowance, people who don't come from very wealthy backgrounds, it is also a time when it's pretty tough and grim. I mean, youth allowance now is still only $39 a day, and I probably don't need to share that with some of you. And my undertaking to those of you who are relying on Social Security for your primary source of income, I promise that ACOSS and all of our members will continue to push hard to deliver better social protections and economic supports, so that over the next period, as we deal with the instability, no question, I'm sure, about economic futures, as we deal with, no question, the challenges of climate change, that people who have got the least are protected first and foremost, and that's what I continue to be involved in doing. And I'm sure many of you are involved in activism in some ways, but if this year is not the year for you to be involved in activism, if this is the year, and Sam, I'm hoping this is resonating with what you were saying earlier, if this is the year for you just to manage to turn up, that's okay too. What Pinnacle is doing is providing, yes, financial support, and that really does matter. I have a view that we could do much better in terms of the big levers to deliver better economic supports for people. But what no government can give you is, I think, what Pinnacle is actually offering. Scholarships, they do matter, but it isn't just about the money, it's about family and community. It is a sense of, if you need to check in, to be reminded about how fabulous you are, this is a place that you can do that. I have needed to do that over and over again through the course of my 50 plus years now. I still value those moments when people privately text me and say, good job, or are you okay? Those moments really matter for us, the personal, the relationships. So I don't know who you might be tracking down in 30 years' time to sit that person down and to tell them how your history was changed, how your story got changed in these days and weeks ahead. But I do know that I speak for everybody who's been involved and continues to be involved in Pinnacle, how absolutely delighted we are to be around and to watch as you write your story. So thank you for the time this afternoon. I wish I could see you all, but I can certainly feel just how great this day has been so far, and good luck with the next bit. Thanks, Andrew and Paula. Thank you, everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cassandra. As always, absolutely inspiring. We do have maybe just 10 minutes left. Cassandra, would you be comfortable if anyone had a question they'd like to put to you?
Absolutely.
Or a comment?
Yeah, no comments, and you know, anything that yeah, I would wish I could meet you. That's my, you know, I'm a hugger though, so watch out.
Does anyone have a, yeah, please.
I always have questions, Andrew. Cassandra, when you caught up with your mentor over in the UK 20 years later, yeah, what was his response?
He was teary, Sam. He's a man of very few words, so he wasn't the one doing all the hugging. He was not a hugger. He was a very Oxford professor. And what I was struck by again was how humble he is. Seriously, Sam, I had no idea when I first met him over in London just how eminent he was. I was just this little, you know, coming from Australia, and he was always so generous with his like, I thought I had new ideas, and I remember him gently saying, well, usually nothing is new under the sun. In other words, there's only been about 200 years of, you know, scholarly works on that idea, and I'll refer you to it. But he just is a very humble person, Sam, that I could tell. He got really teary as I spoke with him, and and I'm still in contact with him actually, and his son is teaching up in Newcastle now, so it was really lovely to connect.
It's so brilliant, the power of relationships across time and place, and yeah, even after 20 years, it sounds like it was still as it was when you were there. In the chat, we've got one question from lovely Eloise. Did you, oh, it's just disappeared. Did you work in any other organisations in policy before your current job?
Yeah, I did. So I nearly left the law because I started in private practice, and then I did the Masters, which was about international human rights and the developing world, and that's where I really, because it was Commonwealth, so I was studying alongside people from Africa, people from Asia, so that was really, the world just opened up for me. I came back and then I worked in legal aid for quite a long time, and then one of the, still I think the best job I've had so far for me in so many ways was working in Darwin at the Community Legal Centre. And so that's where I really, Sam, I learn about grassroots activism, because you don't get more, if anybody from the Northern Territory is here, it's a very special place, 30% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and I just learnt so much. And then I was at the Australian Human Rights Commission. So that's where I did a lot of really solid policy and policy development work. And so this is sort of this thread. Trust me, it was not a great plan. It was not a grand plan when I was 20. I had no idea. There were just sort of sometimes somebody tapped me on the shoulder to say, did you think about Darwin? And I went, no. And then it was the best thing I ever did, actually. 5 years there. Yeah.
It sounds like a phenomenal career that it's just going to keep going. Just keeping with the chat questions, because I think that seems to be people's preference for putting them through. I'm just going to have a quick look here. Can I ask if it was a long road to talking to your parents again after you came out to them? And that's from one of our WA scholars, lovely Darcy.
Yeah, hi Darcy. The conversation continued throughout my life, actually. My father was never able to really get there. And if I can keep this in the cone, Darcy, can we keep it in the cone? Even today, one of my nieces is now got her first love as a woman. Yeah. And even today, her father, my brother, does not want to share it with our father. We're still navigating it.
That's really sad to hear, but it's awesome to hear that you have managed to make steps in that. At least I have older family members who are not exactly as accepting as would be ideal. And yeah, it's just really nice to see that there can be. It's a long, hard road, but it's
a long, hard road. And I definitely came to a view that my sexuality, the notion of being proud of it. And so, if my partner couldn't come to a family function, I did not go. I got to that point of going, I'm not going to play that game anymore and feel like I'm the one to be guilty about creating the problem here. So yeah, but I think I'm very aware around me sometimes, particularly in the cis world, there's this sort of notion of, it's so much better now. And I go, well, I think it kind of depends on context, and you've all got your own experiences, I'm sure, and some are fabulous and some are really hard.
I can see in the chat that we have another question in a similar kind of theme. Just wanting to hear maybe about how you've been able to maybe forgive family, or if that's still and it's resonating with lots of people, what you're saying.
That is a beautiful question. So look, I have a little Buddha that sits on my windowsill, and by my bed I have a little pink heart-shaped crystal. There's a little insight I'm sharing with you on a Saturday afternoon. And I'm not a Buddhist. I don't have a religious faith. But what I took away from those teachings was the power of forgiveness and love, of no matter how much somebody can hurt you, to find a place to actually stay with the kindness and love in your interaction with that person. Now, it's not to say that you put up with being hurt. It may mean that actually you walk away from them, but to get to that place where the power of yourself acting out of love and forgiveness. And that, no question, has meant for me that I have not ended up being really bitter, because I'm the one that loses out of that. And it actually, it's not always easy. And I do have, particularly my sister Chelsea, she's really good at the, she says, oh, they're just fuckers. It's good to have those moments, right? Certainly I had those moments last week as I was watching, in terms of Somebody Extraordinary, Grace Tame, right? I did not necessarily want to act out of love and forgiveness as I saw some of the shocking behaviours of some of the men who tried to tear down another one of our fantastic activists. But ultimately, it's been a very important thing for me to be able to stay open to my family. I love my nephews and nieces, and I'm so glad that I'm there for my niece rather than having become completely separated from them.
Such a brilliant response. I got tingles. Just
really beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, just another question's come through in the chat. Many of my generation's parents have not been to university. In a time when everyone from high school goes on to uni, and instead of applying in a pool of 300, we're competing against potentially 10,000 applicants. What is your advice for standing out from the crowd? I would love to pursue prestigious educational opportunities in the law like you have, but it seems impossibly out of reach.
So I think being prepared to keep asking questions and being prepared to keep seeking out and connecting with people. I mean, I think that's one of the really fantastic offerings through Pinnacle. I do want to encourage you and I know the team work very hard on matching mentors, but don't feel confined to that mentor. Be prepared to say, this is actually what I need. Don't feel captured by that relationship. Your mentor will want to know if actually you need to connect with somebody else. Because relationships do matter, and it's both for support, but also for door opening. And that really does make a huge difference. And I think we know very well the inequities in the world. I mean, people often say that, when you go to certain schools, what it does is it opens up the relationships as much as the formal qualification. And when you meet people who you love or who inspire you, to try and stay connected to them. I talk about them as the keepers in my life, the people that I just, and to build your relationships. I know increasingly, of course, we're in a very online life, and loneliness gets talked about a lot. I feel it, that sort of it actually seems harder to build genuine, deep relationships that will actually help to open doors. But I really want to encourage you to not give up on that, to seek out physical places, to go physically to places, because that also is part of, I think, building your confidence to keep pushing, because there are, as I say, it's okay those days just to show up, but there are also those days where you say, I want to forge ahead with my aspirations and what I want to do in my life. And yes, there will be those times where it's like a slap in the face, and they're the times to be frank with people who can support you and to regroup.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. And I think the one thing I would add to that is maybe it's a bit cliche, but just believing in yourself and, all of the positive self-talk that can sometimes get diminished. So doing things like that. I can see that Alejandro has their hand up. Did you want to ask a question, or were you...
Yes, I did want to ask some questions.
Yeah, please go.
Nice to meet you all. I have a question to Cassandra in its personal focus. And I was wondering if through the years, your approaching strategies has changed to approach your family rejection in some case. And if this has been the case, what are those factors that help you build these strategies? And yeah, that's basically my question.
Yeah. Yes, it has. And you've made me want to actually think even more about that, because it's a very insightful question. I had very angry phases. I had periods where I did disconnect completely. I had periods where I wrote long, very emotional emails, widely distributed. I had times where I sat my brother down and basically begged him to stand up for me in the family and to do things differently. And then I think what happens is because of the people, your chosen family, the people who reflect back to you to be proud of yourself, even when you're getting rejected, even when they don't reply to the emails, even when they don't return the phone calls, that I've come more to be confident in myself about my value in that family, and that I don't sweat the small stuff in the same way, because I don't actually need their approval anymore. Which is this, that one, right? And that's a childlike place to be, and we are all children in the end. And I know when my dad passes away, because he's got us sooner, right? He's got there will be a grief for me. It's real, that he will never celebrate my sexuality and that kind of thing. But I don't need it in the same way, because I've created different places to get that kind of sense of my own value in personally and in the world. Yeah.
All right, thanks so much for your answer.
Cass, I think I know we've had lots of rich questions, but I'm really conscious that we're now just heading over time. But I wonder whether I could encourage everyone on the call to put their hands together to say a huge thank you to Cassandra for just an absolutely inspirational session. We are so grateful to have you as someone in the Pinnacle family, and it's a real privilege to have you with us this afternoon, so thank you.